Hello, I'm Jose Olivares, and welcome to Salón Chingón, a podcast where we discuss investigative journalism, social movements, and political developments worldwide. This podcast is a production of the Salon of Authentic Journalism. Now, this inaugural episode is our first episode, and it comes just 2 months after a secretive U.S. government operation in which they abducted the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. The U.S. military bombed Caracas, they stormed Maduro's compound, and they abducted him and his wife, Maduro and his wife, when they brought them to New York while they sit in federal prison waiting for their cases to continue. Now, for years, the U.S. government has accused Maduro and other top Venezuelan officials of drug trafficking. They've accused Maduro of running what is called the Cartel de los Soles. And now in this latest indictment, they're also accusing him of working with various organized crime groups throughout Latin America. It includes a number of Colombian rebel groups, some Mexican cartels, and also a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua. And so we're also bringing you this episode just 2 weeks after another major escalation, another major development in the drug war. So a couple of weeks ago, the Mexican armed forces, using intelligence provided by the U.S. government, they killed El Mencho. El Mencho was the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is one of Mexico's biggest organized crime groups. Now, all these cases are major escalations in the drug war, major escalations when it comes to U.S. government involvement in Latin America, in the region at large. But all these cases don't come from nowhere. They don't exist in a vacuum. Rather, there's a very long history that we need to pay attention to when we're analyzing these developments. So joining us today is Bill Conroy. Bill is a longtime investigative journalist who's been covering the drug war, and he's very familiar with this long history. Bill has published a new book, and it's called The Great Pretense, A Tour Through the Boneyard of the CIA's War for Drugs, and it is out now. Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here, Jose. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thank you. So first, I just want to get your initial reaction to the Maduro kidnapping and abduction. I mean, he's facing these federal drug trafficking charges. A lot of these organizations that he's accused of working with have been deemed in the past year to be foreign terrorist organizations. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on your initial thoughts, what you were thinking as soon as the abduction happened, and what you think about his case more broadly.
Well, I to be honest with you, Jose, his case to me is kind of like secondary because it was all kind of a pretense to start. And they kind of broke international law to bring him back here to try him in U.S. courts. And I mean, there's just so many contradictions that to be serious about it as a legal case, it's. I mean, you heard the latest today as we're recording this, the story's out that the U.S. is preventing him from using any resources from Venezuela for his defense. So his lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, which ain't going to happen. And we kind of saw this with the Noriega trial years ago. Noel Noriega from Panama, who was a CIA asset and also, helped to facilitate a lot of drug shipments through Panama, and including to assist with the Iran-Contra scandal. The arms for drugs for the Contras back then. We started a war there, went down and abducted him, brought him back here for trial. And the trial, because of the nature of it, everything he was, not that he was innocent, trust me, he wasn't, but in my book, but the way they handled it was kind of just a joke. They just wrapped national security around anything that was going to be controversial. And so you didn't really get an insight into it if you're covering the trial, because so much of it was just so narrow to these specific charges, not really bringing in the fact that he was getting paid by the CIA essentially to help facilitate drug trafficking to advance their national security objectives. So that part of it. No surprises. What's been interesting to follow, though, is the real reason for it, and trying to figure out what's going to happen next is the oil, right? Initially they shipped out sold a couple million barrels, right, from a tanker, I think, that they seized, and it went to Qatar, right, some Qatar account, and then opaque. Where did that money go now? Well, now they're out with the story that they're going to get 80 million barrels from Venezuela, and it's going to go into the U.S. Treasury accounts. And then they're actually micromanaging the budget of Venezuela right now, determining what they can spend, what they can't, how much, down to the penny, I'm sure. And I can't help but think, they're accusing Venezuela of having corruption in the government, right? I think it's pretty opaque as to where all this oil money's going right now. And given the
Mm,
corruption in the Trump administration, which is known, you have to ask yourself, is this just a case of one corrupt regime, interrogating another corrupt regime? It's not like the people's interests are being served in either case with this stuff, right? At least as I see it. And also on top of that, we know that Trump had owned land in the Dominican Republic, and during his first administration, this came out in public records, and he ended up selling off some of that land. And there was a story that we did for Narco News at the time, and that the Miami Herald followed up on, discovered that he sold some of that land to an affiliate of the Chavista, regime. So he was sitting there blowing up drug boats, talking about narco terrorism, and he's profiting off of blood money from the drug trade, right? So there's the hypocrisy is just so thick and all this. It's hard to know what to take serious. I mean, yeah, it's all serious, but it's hard to take any of them serious. It's so much as propaganda and deception and misdirection, right? And that's the
yeah.
nature of this drug war.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what's interesting is it's not just Trump, right? It's also Marco Rubio, right? Who is,
Yes.
really leading the charge against this aggression on Latin America. And his brother-in-law for years was working with Colombian cocaine traffickers, right? So, what's interesting about kind of the drug war that you mentioned is for years, they've had the kingpin strategy, right? The strategy goes that the U.S. government wants, they want the top guy leading the singular, organization, the single cartel, and they go after the El Chapos, they go after the Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, they go after El Mencho, right? But as a result of this kingpin strategy, these groups end up dividing and splintering and creating new factions, and that is how the Jalisco New Generation cartel in Mexico, one of the most powerful criminal groups now in Mexico, how it came into being. And El Mencho who was killed this past week was a direct kind of he directly came from this and was able to consolidate so much power due to this kingpin strategy. I'm wondering if you can talk us through a little bit about just the U.S. government's drug war strategy, considering this recent latest development in which Mexican forces, with the assistance of U.S. intelligence, killed El Mencho in Mexico.
Well, again, this is part of that larger new U.S. foreign policy of Latin America, very aggressive policy of Latin America, militaristic. Because they're using Venezuela to leverage oil down from Cuba to try to destabilize Cuba, right? So basically, and they're going to mess with the Colombian elections to make sure they get which won't be the leftist candidate if they have their way. So there's that backdrop, and then the drug war, since Nixon is who started it, and at the time it was 71, 72. Ehrlichman later said, he's one of Nixon's top eight, said, the drug war was started for the very reason that we couldn't target the blacks and we couldn't target the hippies, the anti-war protesters, for being black or for being, for exercising First Amendment rights, but we could criminalize heroin and criminalize marijuana and then use that as the excuse to go in and surveil them and arrest them and throw them in jail. And I think that pretty much describes what the strategy. Now, it's always been a propaganda kind of misdirected war. It's never been serious about stopping demand in the U.S. in terms of harm reduction programs. This is addiction control. That's never been a priority. Just like giving health care to Americans has never really been a priority for at least the Republican Party. And then who's now in control? That's who we're talking about. And also, the de facto way it works is all these law enforcement and intelligence agencies are competing over turf and money, budgets. And the way you make yourself known and get a bigger budget, or at least get to chalk up a victory in the current narrative of the drug war, is to bust kingpins. You notice how much news and the media is complicit in this because this goes on over and over. I saw it during the Calderon era, right, when we had that war on drugs that resulted in this mass scale up and bloody violence in Mexico, and we're seeing similar violence levels there now. I mean, 200,000 dead in Mexico since 2016 and 67,000 disappeared, right? They're paying the price for our drug war because our drug war is really taken out on their backs, and we're not really doing anything to stop the drugs here in terms of the demand. And if anything, there's more drugs available and at lower prices. So yeah, they make these kingpin. It's a strategy thing. They get a week's worth of or a couple weeks worth of play out of it, and that looks chalk up a victory. And when midterms come around, the politicians look good for that, and the law enforcement agencies get to goose their budget some more to go after some more kingpins, right? And we just revolving door of kingpins. And you're right, we take out a kingpin and there's a power vacuum either internally because cartels, which are a misnomer anyway. There's a half a dozen
Yeah.
or more criminal organizations, and they're all part of these larger networks that are actually international. But the long and short is you take out the kingpin, so there's a power vacuum in the center that can lead to infighting within that criminal organization. And from the exterior, where rivals see vulnerabilities where they can take over drug routes or plazas. And all that leads to gunfights and bombs and shootings and kidnappings and just awful stuff. And most of it is directed, at the cartel players, the people that are in the game. But you can't have that much firepower on the streets without innocents suffering. And there's also just some sociopaths involved that, if your brother's in the cartel, they may well come after your family, right? If he owes them money, that kind of thing, or if he's on the lam. So it's like any criminal business. It's nasty. And it's deadly. But a lot of people get into it because, like I was told by, the House and Death informant, he said, a lot of these people are facing a lifetime of poverty, and their attitude is, I'd rather have 5 years of a glorious life in the cartel than, a lifetime of poverty and despair. And so they're willing to do this, and I see that in the inner cities when I was covering the drug war in the inner cities of the United States, like in Milwaukee, where I cut my teeth on it. It was a sharp divide between the people dealing the drugs or selling the drugs and the people buying it. And it wasn't over personality or it did break down along skin color because it was all in the inner city, which was black and which had no economy. It was the economy of poverty, and so you made money by slinging rock, right? That's The Wire, if you ever saw that series. And the people buying it were all the white kids from the suburbs, right? And the ones doing the hard time for the drug war were all the black folks and kids in the inner city, right? And the white folks had good lawyers and could get the stuff expunged from their records in many cases, most cases probably. So this just ripples through our society from a micro level to a macro level. So should it be any surprise that we have a drug war that's a pretense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because this year is going to mark the 20 years since the Mexican drug war was launched by Felipe Calderón and Genaro Garcia Luna. Genaro Garcia Luna was a cabinet level secretary for Felipe Calderón, and just a couple of years ago, he was convicted in New York City of working with the Sinaloa cartel, which everybody knew already.
Yeah.
It just kind of shows you how corruption
But
rises
he
to the
was,
top.
remember back then too, he was like promoted as this big, drug war warrior for the US. And they had to eat a lot of
Yeah,
crow when that happened. It's just, that
absolutely.
happens over and over. These guys that they get in bed with are as, crooked as the criminals they allege they're going after.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the New York Times they wrote this really glowing profile of him in 2006, 2008 or something. They called him Mexico's top cop, and it was this like really colorful kind of profile in the New York Times on Genaro Garcia Luna. But I think this kind of brings up this next question of how the media portrays the drug war, right? It's very much the good guys, the DEA, the CIA versus the bad guys, right? The cartel leaders and the cartel members. But I think what your work does really well is it kind of it shows how those lines are extremely blurry. I mean, or almost non-existent, or how that kind of dichotomy, that whole structure just kind of crumbles to the ground when you actually look at how a lot of these operations are carried out on the ground. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the history of the CIA specifically in the drug war and with its own history of drug trafficking and involvements throughout the region and throughout these past decades.
Yeah, I mean, the CIA's involvement goes almost back to well, the Vietnam War is where I pick it up in the book, and Southeast Asia and how it was used to fund and prop up U.S. allies, similar to Afghanistan. We let them sell heroin or opium to prop up their economy or their armies and their warlords. And actually in Vietnam, to the extent that the CIA cutouts were flying the drugs, right? And, that's the era America and all that. And it continued through distorting foreign policy for various reasons. In the Latin American biggest example started with Iran Contra, which was Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series is what really blew that wide open. But even before then, people knew what was going on, but it was not covered in the mainstream media. What Gary did is he forced the mainstream media to confront it. And how did they confront it? They destroyed him instead of investigating the story. Yeah. So that tells you all you need to know about the business we're in. As Chuck Bowden once told me, you can collect a paycheck every 2 weeks as long as you don't draw blood. And I think that's Gary said as much. He said he's won Pulitzers before that, and part of Pulitzer teams. And he said I didn't realize that none of those stories. I didn't to this effect that none of those stories mattered. That's why they didn't go after me. But when I finally wrote one that did, yeah, this is what happens. And he used to talk that way to me a little bit when I had a few conversations I was able to have with him before he died, that, talking about, getting away with punching them in the nose before they go after you. And, it's a red badge of courage when they do. Because the reality is if you're a journalist trying to pursue these kind of stories, there's no real monetary reward. If anything, there's a lot of risk, and there's all kinds of disincentives, especially if you're in the mainstream establishment. Which is very risk averse and profit driven. Newspapers don't want their computers stolen. They don't want, feds running around their newsrooms, shutting them down or threatening their corporations, as Trump does now, with, even more so with losing their licenses, et cetera. So they're push comes to shove, they'll throw you under the bus because they're driven by profits. So you gotta, we're never going to get anywhere as long as the system is set up that way. It's got a governor on it, if you will. And, as it moved into Latin America in the CIA's role, the CIA has never been interested in drugs. I mean, they have to the extent they can use them to advance their other priorities, but it isn't drugs. They don't have a team of anti-narcotics, investigators going after drug. No, they're after intelligence and covert operations to affect the mandates out of the White House, which in Latin America right now is regime change, or at least regime capture. Right now what we're doing is more regime capture. It's almost like a new form of colonialism, gunboat colonialism. But the CIA is there to, whether you agree with it or not, that's their job, right? That's what they're going to do. And if they have to cultivate a narco trafficker to get intelligence or leverage on a government to achieve those kind of ends, they're going to make sure they have that narco trafficker, on their payroll, and that narco trafficker is going to continue to operate, for no other reason. They don't want to, have him outed, right? If they suddenly, bust him, he's not an asset anymore. He can't be useful. And the DEA is just, I use them as an example because in the book, there are many cases where DEA and CIA were at loggerheads, where DEA agents are telling me actively that they were trying to keep cases away from CIA because CIA would blow them up or steal their assets or otherwise undermine the investigations. And that's because the DA wanted to bust the drugs, agree with it or not. So they had these diametrically opposed tensions and missions and turf wars. And on the edges of that is where you find a lot of corruption. Because if you're running an asset for the CIA, and for example, like they did in the 90s, and they let the Venezuelan, in that case of, when it was a capitalist regime, the Venezuelan National Guard run drugs because they had dirty generals then, like we have, well, anyway, they had dirty, so, and they busted them like, I don't know, a ton of cocaine or more on the border. And the DEA, for the first time ever, came out and called the CIA out on drug running on 60 Minutes, right? That goes back to the 90s, but it just hasn't stopped. One person told me in the book that he says, there's never been a CIA operation that's been, even halfway effective that isn't repeated. It's repackaged,
Mm,
repeated because,
yeah.
they work. Why would they not? And so this very, iterations of this, of the, of these tensions in this kind of, using drugs to leverage, regime influence or the gun trade to leverage regime change, especially when these are covert operations, where that's the most effective way to bring people to your side in that particular country or to marshal resources. Yeah, they're going to let it happen. And they're not going to care what happens downstream of those drugs. And if DA doesn't catch it, in fact, DA is probably going to be kept away from that. Those drugs are coming in the country at the same time we got it, being sold this bill of goods about, narco terrorists, right?
Right.
That's the game, and within that, there are examples where there'll be just corrupt or corrupt agents or corrupt, CIA assets for sure, and the case
Mm,
officers are back in Washington, but the ones that do go in the field can be bought off just like federal agents can be and have been in the past, and customs inspectors and border patrol. The reason drugs get through the bridges, the international bridges, and a lot of them have, and even though the border shut down, commerce isn't, is because inspectors are bought off regularly. And over the years, you'll see many cases of when they catch them, because it's just a wink and a nod. If they're in the right position, they have the right surveillance, their three trucks are through. And even if one gets caught by design to throw them off so the other two can get through, it happens. They have very many stealthy techniques to move drugs across our borders. And meanwhile, the demand here is not even thought about, right? Like it's
right.
disjointed the approach to dealing with the demand and particularly the addiction. It's
Yeah.
once you're off insurance, you're back in the streets if you're an addict, right? I mean, they're not there to cure addicts; they're there to milk some more blood out of their veins. That's about it. Sometimes, although there are good programs, I mean, it's just we don't have a comprehensive approach to this money laundering.
Right.
All this money has to be laundered, right? And the CIA, is got its fingers in that world too because they have assets in the money laundering business because that's the way it works. And billions and billions of dollars have to be laundered every year, drug money, and we don't really go after the banks or the crypto. I mean, you don't see us really cracking down on that stuff, do you? I mean, here and there you'll see a case,
Mm,
and they'll settle the case, slap on the wrist, fine them far less than they made on the money laundering, and they're back in business. So it's a game, and it's if anyone took a hard look at it, most people are too busy to, but you spend some years looking at it, you see it, I see it. It's but trying to communicate that to the media through the media to the readers is very difficult, especially in this fractured environment. So,
yeah.
and especially when the mainstream media has every disincentive to tell that story. So the narrative's off. The narrative is almost by design cartoonish.
Now, if you've joined us so far, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. But just want to recap a little bit of what Bill and I discussed during this conversation. So, just to backtrack a little bit, right? During our conversation, Bill and I talked about the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, this is a scandal that took place in the 1980s. And during this time, it was discovered that the Reagan administration, the Ronald Reagan administration in the US, was illegally selling weapons in Iran and using the proceeds from those weapon sales to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, these right-wing rebel groups in Nicaragua, in order to fight the left-wing government that had recently just taken power, right? Now, this was a huge scandal in the 1980s and 90s when it finally came to light. But it's really interesting to note how the CIA was involved and these US government intelligence agencies were involved in selling these weapons to Iran and then secretly using those funds to support the Nicaraguan right-wing Contras in that country. Now, we also discussed Gary Webb. Gary Webb was an incredible investigative journalist. In the 1990s, Gary Webb revealed in a series of stories called The Dark Alliance that the right-wing Nicaraguan Contras, right, this Contra group, the right-wing Contras in the country of Nicaragua, were trafficking cocaine and using those funds to fund their rebel fight, right? Now, what Gary Webb revealed is that the Nicaraguan Contras were trafficking drugs and selling drugs to lower income communities in the United States with either the knowledge of the CIA or with outright support of the CIA, right? Now, this was a huge, huge scandal, right? Because Gary Webb was able to expose that there's a very clear pipeline between the Nicaraguan Contras and the crack epidemic in the US that was really gripping specifically major cities and inner cities in the United States, and making that link and demonstrating that the CIA may have been or was actively involved in helping traffic those drugs into the US just was a huge, significant shock to the system, right? Now, sadly, Gary Webb died in 2004, and this happened years after years of his reputation just being absolutely tarnished, kind of in retaliation for his reporting on this crack cocaine trafficking scandal. Now, for this next segment, Bill and I are going to be discussing some of the tactics that are used by U.S. federal government agencies when it comes to the drug war. One of the tactics that we discuss that we really, really hammer in on is this use of confidential informants. Now, confidential informants, what they are is they are criminals or former criminals who kind of live in this in-between area between criminality and working with law enforcement. And so what these informants do is they provide information to the US government, to US federal law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies about the criminal groups that these agencies are trying to take down, right? A lot of these agencies, that includes the DEA, Homeland Security Investigations, the FBI, the CIA, right? And so they have teams and networks of informants that are providing information about the criminal groups that they're trying to target, right? And so that's what we're going to be discussing in this next part of our conversation. Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and it's like you said, it's a game, but it's a very, very dirty game, right? I mean, I think you're talking about money laundering, and there's a really interesting case that's playing out right now in one of the New York federal courts, where this former DEA agent who had retired, his name was Paul Campo, and one of his friends, Roberto Sartini, this like Italian Colombian man, they were accused of attempting to launder money for the Jalisco New Generation cartel, right? And so, their case is proceeding. They're sitting in federal prison right now as they wait for all the evidence and discovery to be presented and for the case to continue. But Sartini, this Robert Sartini guy, he was a longtime CIA asset as well, right? But what's interesting about that case is the way it was built up. It was built up by the DEA by using a confidential informant, right? These undercover informants, and that's how a lot of these federal agencies try to, build up their cases, right? Is they have these networks of informants. They sometimes send them in to do controlled purchases and controlled deliveries of drugs, and sometimes they sit in these meetings and they have wires sitting in their shirts or whatever. And I think that brings me to one of the most fascinating cases, I think in the entire drug war history, when it comes to the use of informants, and that is a case that you worked on, the House of Death case. Just for a little bit of context for listeners, so right now ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, this agency in the U.S. Is making it's like the biggest story in the U.S. right now, right? Because they're the ones that are carrying out Trump's mass deportation, anti-immigrant crackdown. But ICE is divided into two separate parts, right? It is enforcement and removal operations, which are they're the deportation guys, right? They're the guys that are going out and arresting immigrants, and they're the guys that are making the headlines. But at the same time, there's Homeland Security Investigations, these special agents who have an international presence in over 50 countries. And nobody really knows about HSI, but you've done a lot of really fascinating work when it comes to HSI and one specific case, the House of Death case. So if you could walk us through a little bit of HSI's operation, their informant, and what you were able to discover with your investigative journalism.
Yeah, I would just say one thing, and maybe it's gotten different in the last few years, but when I was covering it, the line between the ICE investigations, or as they call it, HSI now, and immigration roundup, which none of them really liked going on, or many of them, because they considered it beneath them, was not hard. I mean, these agents if they're needed to go do immigration roundups, they're detailed to that. It depends on their personnel and what caseload they got. So it isn't like there's a solid line there, right? But
Sure.
generally
Right.
speaking, Yeah, there were about 6,000 investigative agents at the time I was, or at least the person that oversaw ICE had about 6,000 agents. And, a good number of them are going to be criminal investigators when they're working criminal cases and not put on the details for immigration. And they investigate the same thing DEA does or FBI. And many of them were very good. They came out of U.S. Customs, which was
Yeah.
that had been around since the 1700s, and that got just abolished, and ICE was stood up along immigration immigration and naturalization services, our old migra, and U.S. Customs, U.S. Customs Service were merged and then shaken up, and the
Yeah.
INS inspectors and the ICE or the customs inspectors or customs investigators were put into ICE, right? So it's a merger of INS and customs, and it's not that old.
Yeah.
And right out of the boat, it had, problems. It had a chip on its shoulder because it was trying to prove itself. No one took them serious. INS had problems long before that, horrible reputation. Much what you're seeing on the streets now was happening on the border with INS. It was really not a good
Yeah.
agency, right? And they had to get rid of it, or they would have kept it. So it was rolled into this not post 9/11 world. And so, yeah, ICE was in this particular case, it was actually a joint, the House of Death case in Juarez, and run out of El Paso, Mexico City, and Juarez, where they had a residence office. DEA did anyway there, and they were investigating the Juarez cartel, and it was like this binational task force, FBI, DEA, ICE, Mexican law enforcement were on it. And right out of the bat, they're all fighting with each other. DEA hated ICE, ICE hated DEA, FBI was running off on their own, doing cases in Spain and messing up cases back here. And nobody wanted to talk to the Mexican law enforcement because they didn't trust them, except DEA that had a better relationship with them. So it was all messed up to be, right out of the box in many ways. But
Yeah.
ICE, wanted to shine. So they ended up in cooperation with a U.S. attorney up that way. They were making cases with this informant out of Juarez who came across the bridge one day and just said, I want to be an informant. And, this guy had already had a lot of experience in the drug trade and was, connected. He was a made man in the drug trade, as they came to find out. A lot smarter than they gave him credit for sure. And, so they recruited him, and everyone was using him to make, everything from cigarette cases to credit card cases, because he's, and then they decided one day they wanted to, go after the Juarez cartel through this task force, and he was recruited for that. And he kind of warned them up front, this is serious business. These people don't play around. Essentially, if you're going to do this, you got to be serious about it. He never thought they were serious about it. They thought they were a joke, really. And he played them, I think like a piano, from what I could see in hindsight. But he was put in charge. He was a high level guy in a cell of the Juarez cartel that was overseeing these houses. This is back in 2004, where they murder people either off-site or at these houses and then bury them there. It was, and there were like three of these houses all within 2 miles of each other that I found, and he was in charge of one of them. And his job was to either open up the house for when they're going to bring someone over to murder him. He participated in some of the murders, depending on how you want to describe participate, but clearly, he was a participant in at least three of them. And then he was, in charge of getting the guys that were hired to bury the bodies in the backyard, and then closing up the house, and and he was also in charge of running loads across the border. He was running a couple teams that were doing that. So he was kind of a rising star in the Juarez cartel. And he is suddenly an ICE informant. And so the first murder at this house, he tape recorded because he, I think just to save his own skin in case something went south on the U.S. side of the border. And he comes back in and he says, "This just happened. Here's the tape of it." And they listened to it. And I said, "Okay, I'll tell you what. Don't make any more of these tapes. Just go back there, bury the body, do what they tell you, and we'll keep running the case." And they had wired up the leader of this cell, so ICE knew in real time when these murders were going to happen, and they just let them continue to the point where there were at least 12 murders. 12 people, arguably 13. One they never would ever fess up to, that the informant said was a U.S. citizen. And there was substantial evidence he wasn't murdered there, but he was buried back there. And so this just went on, and so essentially they paid this informant like $200,000 for his work, a little more than that, and he still took him to court saying he was owed more. And between summer of 2003 and or 2004 and over a 3-month period, essentially, there were like a dozen murders. And then what happened, what blew it all up, is the cell that this informant was attached to decided to target a DEA agent in Juarez in his house, thinking he was corrupt because there were corrupt agents around. They thought they were going to go over there and shake him down for his loads or however, take over his territory. And so they sure thought he was going to be killed, right? And so the cartel and soldiers go to his house, and he's not there because he's at the embassy, and his wife and kids are there. And they knew enough not to answer the door, and they immediately called him. So he races back, picks them up, and they're tailed and suddenly pulled over, on a street in Juarez, the typical cartel pullover, or cop too, right? Car in front of your car and back, and a car on the side, you're stuck, you can't get out. And it was pretty certain there was a big fear he was gonna, and his family could have been killed. But he got a call out to the embassy, and someone else from the embassy came over, and they managed to call the informant. And the informant called the head of the cell saying, "No, these guys don't do anything. These guys are basically law enforcement." But of course, the Juarez cartel guy didn't know at that point that the informant was an informant. So he was just a trusted confidant. So he pulled his men off, right? And then they rolled up the head of that cartel right after that. But they could have shut this case down months earlier, like before the first murder, or for sure after the first murder, because they had already had enough evidence to do that, but they all wanted to make a bigger case, get a bigger headline, get a bigger budget. The story of the drug war. And that a dozen people had to die for that. And part of it is there's some racism, obviously, big time, where, their attitude, and some express as much, is, these are just, this is Juarez and El Paso and a bunch of Mexicans no one gives a shit about. And that's why they thought that's what the callousness you're seeing on the streets of the U.S. from ICE now is the same callousness I saw back then. It doesn't surprise me in the least. And it's a problem. But that's the story of that. And, eventually they did bust the informant. The book goes in, it just follows the whole case. It kind of, unpacks it. It starts out with the murders and then unpacks it and follows all the players. The new book is more of a, kind of a part history, but it's also, part memoir. So it's really kind of me talking about covering it while telling you what I covered to try to give you what it was like to cover it, while at the same time not, mixing up what I'm finding, and trying to, make the reader part of the discovery as I was discovering it, because that's the way I thought it was best written, and that's the way it happened. So
excellent, yeah.
And I don't know that I have any great takeaway, or I guess the long and short of the book is the goal is once you read all these episodic adventures that happen, the pattern should start to emerge. And I try to point it out, but I just hope readers can see it on their own, that there is a pattern here. And I'm just giving you the benefit of 30, 35 years of covering it that you wouldn't, have if you never, didn't know this world. We'll see. It had to be written. I had to get it off my chest. So.
Bill, thank you so much for joining us. Bill Conroy is a longtime investigative journalist covering the drug war, and his latest book is called The Great Pretense, A Tour Through the Boneyard of the CIA's War for Drugs. You can find it at thegreatpretense.org. Bill, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in to Salón Chingón, a podcast where we discuss investigative journalism, social movements, and political developments worldwide. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.